They threw my suitcase onto the sidewalk, less than an hour after my husband's funeral. My own son told me I didn't belong in that house anymore. He said homelessness suited me. I stood there, surrounded by faces I had once called family, and not one hand reached out. Grief and betrayal hit me harder than death ever could. But he didn't know. He didn't know what his father left behind. And he didn't know what I was about to do with it. The gravel cut into my knees as I scrambled to grab my suitcase from the curb. One wheel was cracked, spinning uselessly. My blouse was still black from the funeral, still damp near the collar. Brandon slammed the door behind me, and the sound felt louder than the church bells that rang just hours earlier. Megan stood inside the doorway, arms crossed, her pearl necklace glinting like teeth in the sunlight. She didn't say a word, just stared, like I was a trespasser in my own life. 23 years I spent in that house. I picked out the curtains in the kitchen, planted the rose bushes by the porch, chose the floor tile Brandon used to crawl across when he was still in diapers. But to them, I no longer belonged. Homelessness suits you. That's what Brandon said, right after the last guest from the service had gone. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted the neighbors to hear, maybe even Angela across the street, who stood frozen in her driveway with her camera still slung around her neck. I didn't cry. Not then. The tears would have felt like permission, and I wasn't about to give them that. They told me to take my things and go. No discussion, no shame. And if you think that's where the story ends, you're wrong. I want to thank those of you listening who've ever been pushed aside by the very people you raised or loved. If you've been made to feel invisible after a lifetime of sacrifice, I see you. Stay with me. Because what happened next? Well, let's just say they should have read the will. I left that house with nothing but 3 bags, my purse, and a pair of shoes that didn't fit right. The sun was too bright for a day like that. The kind of brightness that mocks you while your world is collapsing. I walked down the driveway, head high, heart trembling. Every step felt like walking off a cliff. But it wasn't just the grief. It was the humiliation. I wasn't just a widow. I was discarded. My car was parked on the street. I got in, locked the doors, and sat in silence for a full 5 minutes. My hands gripped the wheels so tight they cramped. The front gate closed behind me, and just like that, I no longer had a home. But what Brandon didn't know, what Megan had never asked, was this. Henry left more behind than just a house. We had discussed everything years ago. After his second stroke, Henry sat me down and said, "Louise, they will come for this when I'm gone. You must be ready." At the time, I told him not to be so dramatic. "Brandon's not like that," I said. "He's your son." But Henry had looked me in the eye and said, "That boy has greed in his bones, and Megan knows how to feed it." So we made arrangements, quiet ones, legal ones, smart ones. I just hadn't expected to need them so soon. I drove to the one person who knew the full story, Clifford Hayes, our attorney for nearly 30 years, and Henry's best friend since college. He wasn't just the man who handled our estate. He was the man who warned Henry never to trust his own son with power. Clifford opened the door before I even knocked. He had seen the clip Angela had posted. I didn't know it then, but by the time I reached his front porch, the whole street had seen it too. He handed me a cup of coffee and sat me down. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. "They've made their move," he said. "Now it's our turn." I nodded, still not crying, still not broken. He handed me an envelope, thick, sealed. Inside was a USB drive, a notarized statement, and a signed video from Henry, dated just 10 months ago. In it, Henry's voice was weaker, but steady. If you're watching this, Louise, it means I've gone. And if Brandon's pushed you out, that means he's shown you who he truly is. I know this hurts, but I also know you. You don't fall apart. You rebuild. That's why everything, all of it, is under your name, not his, not theirs, yours. The investments, the trust, the real estate, the business accounts, all $22 million. Clifford looked at me over the rim of his glasses. You ready to shake their world, Louise? I took a breath, held it, let it out slow. I'm not just ready, I said. I'm done being quiet. And that's when everything started to turn. I didn't go back to my motel that night. Clifford insisted I stay at his guest house until we figured out the next steps. I was too tired to argue and too numb to care. But by morning, I felt it. The sting, the sharp, cold realization that I no longer had a place in the very home I helped build. My toothbrush, my clothes, my wedding ring, still resting in a tray on my old dresser. Gone, or behind locked doors. That house. It didn't belong to me anymore. Not by key. Not by invitation. It wasn't just about the money. That part would come later. What cut deepest was the silence, the message beneath the action. I wasn't needed. I wasn't wanted. I was in the way. By noon, Brandon had already sent me an email, written like a corporate memo. It said I was not to return to the property unless legally escorted. It said I had vacated voluntarily. It said further contact would be considered harassment. Voluntarily. As if I had smiled and skipped my way out the front door. He CC'd Megan. She replied all, one sentence. Please remove her name from the insurance and utilities as soon as possible. They were moving fast. Faster than I thought. The paperwork was already shifting. The narrative was changing. And if I didn't act quickly, their version of events would become the official one. Clifford had warned me. He said, Louise, they'll use bureaucracy as a weapon. Not knives, not fists, but signatures. He was right. I spent the rest of that day in Clifford's study. No small talk, no television noise, just the sound of documents being reviewed, calls being placed, records being gathered. The trust had been airtight. Henry made sure of that. The assets were real. The accounts were active. The legal framework was solid. What we needed now was timing, strategy, and public clarity. And that's where Angela came in. Clifford called her personally. She had already posted the video of Brandon throwing me out. It had barely 300 views at the time, mostly neighbors. But Clifford had an idea. He asked Angela for the raw footage, not to edit, not to dramatize, just to keep it clean and intact. He knew something I didn't. The security camera installed on our porch, the one Brandon often joked was just for show, had also been recording. And when Clifford obtained that feed from the security company, the angles matched Angela's almost perfectly. 2 points of view, same truth. We now had legal power and social proof. But that didn't change the ache in my chest. That night, I sat on the edge of Clifford's guest bed, staring at my suitcase. My clothes were wrinkled, my shoes still dusty from the driveway. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out the last letter Henry had written me. It was dated 2 weeks before he passed. Lou, if they turn on you, don't fight back in anger. Use your silence as a shield. And when the time comes, use your name. Because that's the part they can't steal. Love, H. That sentence stuck in my head. Use your name. I realized what he meant the next morning. Clifford handed me a document that named me not just as beneficiary, but as trustee, managing director, and signatory of every major asset Henry had once owned. The business, the properties, the funds, not just mine to hold, but mine to decide. They hadn't just failed to claim what they wanted, they had removed themselves entirely. But I wasn't ready to play offense yet. Not just because I was tired, not because I was afraid, but because I needed them to feel the quiet. Let them think I was gone. Let them plan. Let them spend. Let them underestimate. Because while they drew up their strategy to erase me, I was about to show them what erasure truly looked like. By late afternoon, I watched the footage Angela sent over. She had recorded every minute of that moment on the porch. Brandon's hand pushing me. Megan's voice saying I was irrelevant. The suitcase tumbling down the steps. It didn't feel like watching myself. It felt like watching someone else, a stranger who had lost everything in under 5 minutes. But I knew who that woman was. She was me 2 days ago, and she was me now. But the second version, the one sitting here, she wasn't going to let it end that way. Brandon had already started calling Henry's old contacts. Business partners, bankers, family friends. He was setting up meetings, claiming succession, calling himself the new head of operations. He didn't know. He had no idea what had already shifted under his feet. So I waited. And while I waited, I built. I built the plan. I built the team. I built the moment. Not with anger, but with focus. He would walk into that room thinking he owned the world, and I would be standing right there, ready to take it back. Brandon had arranged a meeting at the main branch of Harrington Bank for 10 a.m. sharp. He walked in like he owned the place. His tie was too tight, his voice too loud, and his eyes darted across the room as if searching for cameras that might catch his moment of glory. The bank director, Mr. Lorne, had been with the family business for over 20 years. He stood near the glass conference room, shaking hands and gesturing with that familiar corporate calm. I noticed how his expression shifted when he saw me enter, 30 seconds behind Brandon, with Clifford walking quietly beside me. Brandon didn't notice at first. He was too busy telling Mr. Lorne about new directions and vision statements. Megan was there too, in a beige pantsuit that looked 2 sizes too expensive for someone who had never worked a full year in her life. Her smile was thin, polite, the kind that masks expectation with entitlement. Clifford walked ahead of me and addressed Mr. Lorne directly. "We have a scheduled disclosure to present. Mr. Harrington's estate directives, sealed and recorded 6 months before his passing." Brandon turned. His face froze when he saw me. His mouth opened, then closed again, unsure whether to greet or confront. I said nothing. I took a seat at the head of the conference table, opened the leather folder Clifford had handed me, and waited. Clifford gestured to the screen behind Mr. Lorne's desk. A USB was inserted into the slot. The lights dimmed slightly, and then my husband appeared. The room stilled. Henry sat in his favorite chair, wrapped in the wool cardigan he wore during his last winter. His face was thin but firm. His voice had lost none of its weight. "If you're seeing this, it means I'm gone. And if you're watching with Louise beside you, it means you've already tried to push her out." He paused, looked down, then up again. "I built this family's fortune with her. Every decision, every risk, every dollar." She stood beside me. "Not you, Brandon. Not Megan. Not anyone else." He held up a document in his hand. "This trust is final. It was structured to protect Louise. Everything I leave behind, my accounts, my properties, my investments, are under her name. Not in honor, in trust. Because I trust her." He looked directly into the camera. "If you've tried to remove her, shame on you. If you think you can reverse what I've done, think again." Then the screen went black. No music, no fade, just silence. Brandon leaned back, blinking hard. Megan looked at him, but he didn't return her glance. Mr. Lorne cleared his throat and opened a file in front of him. "We've reviewed the trust, notarized and recorded. Everything Mr. Harrington stated has been confirmed. Effective immediately, all assets will remain under the control of Mrs. Harrington, as per his instructions." Brandon's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen since he was 12 and caught cheating on a math test. His voice came back, sharper this time. "That's not possible. He said I would take over the estate. He told me at Christmas he was preparing the transfer." Clifford's tone remained calm. "He told you what you wanted to hear, not what he wrote down." Brandon stood, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "You manipulated him. You made him do this." I looked up slowly, locking eyes with my son. "You don't get to rewrite history because you don't like the chapter you're in." He stared at me, and for a brief moment I saw the little boy I used to carry on my hip. But that version of him had died long before his father did. Megan spoke next. "We deserve a portion. We're family. That money was meant for all of us." Clifford reached into his folder and laid down 3 printed documents. Each one detailed financial support Henry had given Brandon and Megan over the last decade. Mortgage assistance, car leases, private school tuition for their kids. Over $400,000 in total, each payment signed, recorded, and documented. These were gifts, not investments. And Harrington considered them final. Mr. Lorne nodded, "Which means legally there are no outstanding claims or obligations remaining." Brandon's voice cracked. "You really think you can take everything and just walk away with it?" I didn't flinch. "No. I think your father gave me everything and trusted me not to become like you." The air in the room turned cold. No one said a word. Outside the glass walls, I could see people moving through the lobby, a quiet rhythm of ordinary lives continuing while mine stood in this sharp, silent moment. Clifford leaned toward the director. "There's one more item to disclose." Angela had arrived 10 minutes before we walked in. She stood just outside the door with a small drive in her hand. She nodded at me through the glass. Clifford waved her in. This footage, recorded by an eyewitness on July 18th, shows Mr. Brandon Harrington forcibly removing his mother from her residence immediately after Mr. Henry Harrington's funeral. Angela plugged in the drive. The video played. Brandon's voice filled the room, loud, cruel, clear. "You don't belong here. You can rot with his name, but you don't get his house." The suitcase tumbled down the stairs. My body stumbled behind it. Megan's voice came next. "She can sleep in her car like the rest of them." The video ended. Angela left the room as silently as she had entered. Brandon stood motionless. Megan looked down at her shoes. Mr. Lorne's eyes did not leave the screen. Clifford took one final folder from his briefcase and handed it to me. "You hold the authority now, Louise. What happens next is your decision." I stood slowly, picked up the folder, closed it, tucked it under my arm. Then I turned to Brandon and Megan. My voice did not shake. "Leave now. Leave this bank. Leave this city if you must. But understand something. The name Harrington no longer protects you, and the silence you gave me that day, I'm returning it now." Neither of them moved. Clifford gestured toward the door. "It's done." Brandon finally stepped back. Megan followed. They left without another word. I stayed in that room a moment longer, not triumphant, not satisfied, just still. And when I walked out, the sun felt different. Not warmer, but clearer. The part of me they tried to bury had just stood up and walked out on its own 2 feet. By the time Brandon and Megan stepped out of that glass conference room, the world had already begun shifting beneath their feet. They didn't know it yet. They still believed the battle had ended inside that room, that they could lick their wounds in private and bounce back with some damage control and good PR. They were wrong. Angela's video didn't just exist in a drive anymore. That afternoon, she posted it to her platform. The unedited, full-resolution recording with the caption, "After her husband's funeral, they kicked her to the street. Here's what happened next." By nightfall, it had over 40,000 views. By morning, it passed 200,000. I didn't ask her to do that. I hadn't planned for it to go public. But once it did, I didn't stop her either. The comments section exploded. Strangers from across the country weighed in. Retired teachers, widows, mothers, daughters, women who had been pushed aside, silenced, cut off by the very people they raised. They saw themselves in me, and they were furious. But the real storm began when Clifford handed the footage to 2 news outlets that had long covered our family's business ventures. Quietly, strategically, no drama, just facts. A press packet with documents, the video, and Henry's trust. It wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. The headlines the next day were brutal. Bank heir tries to oust mother after funeral, fails spectacularly. Greed has a new name, Brandon Harrington. Widowed matriarch turns tables on entitled son. The story reached the local stations by noon. By 5, national networks had picked it up. Brandon tried to respond. Megan tried harder. They called the coverage slanderous. They accused Angela of staging the video. They claimed I had manipulated Henry in his final days. They hired a crisis management firm. They sent out a press release calling it a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But they had no traction. Not against what people had seen with their own eyes. Not against Henry's recorded will. Not against a grieving woman standing quiet and strong while the people she raised tried to erase her. By the end of that week, 2 of Brandon's largest contracts at Harrington Holdings had been pulled. One from a logistics partner who had worked with Henry for over 15 years. The other from a tech distributor based in Arizona. Both cited a loss of confidence in leadership. Megan's name was quietly removed from the board of a local charity she used to host galas for. A statement was released, thanking her for her past service. Nothing more. And then came the letters. Clifford received 2 formal notices from the county's legal department. The first confirmed an investigation into financial misconduct, triggered by the forged documents Brandon had submitted earlier in the year to access one of Henry's dormant accounts. The second was an ethics complaint filed against Megan for pressuring a former employee at the bank to rush internal transfers. We didn't need to push. The damage was already unfolding. The final blow, though, came not from the courts or the press. It came from inside the family. Megan's sister, Carrie, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out through Clifford. She had seen the footage, she had followed the story, and she had something to share. Emails. Dozens of them. Exchanges between Brandon and Megan during the weeks leading up to Henry's death. Discussions about transferring property titles. Debates about who would take over the foundation. One email titled, "How to Ease Her Out Legally," included bullet points on isolating me from our joint advisors. Carrie had seen enough. She didn't want to be part of it anymore. Clifford submitted the emails as supporting evidence in the pending ethics review. They were also shared, carefully, with the same media outlets who had covered the story first. I didn't say a word publicly. I didn't need to. The silence, just like Henry promised, became my shield. And yet, through all of it, I still felt the ache. The betrayal doesn't vanish just because others see it now. The wound doesn't close because justice finally knocks on their door. I watched from Clifford's porch as reporters knocked on Brandon's gate, asking for statements. I saw the photos of Megan leaving her beauty clinic with her face turned from the cameras. I heard the voicemail Brandon left, his voice thick with panic. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He demanded understanding. He said things had spiraled, that this wasn't the way it was supposed to go, that I needed to help clean it up, for the sake of the family name. But he had burned that name the second he threw me off the steps, and the world had seen the flames. Still, I didn't respond. Not until Clifford told me the investigation was expanding, that Henry's name was being cleared, posthumously of any suspicion, that the trust had stood strong, that every claim against me had collapsed under its own weight. Then I knew it was time to close the door, time to step out of their shadows, not just legally, but emotionally. I wasn't the woman on the steps anymore. I wasn't the wife who stood behind a successful man. I wasn't the mother begging to be heard. I was the Harrington who remained. Brandon requested the meeting through Clifford. He didn't demand it. He didn't threaten. He simply asked, and Clifford left it up to me. I didn't answer right away. I needed a few days, not to decide whether I would see him, but to make sure I wouldn't walk into that room with heat still clinging to my chest. I didn't want revenge. Not now. What I wanted was clarity. Clarity has no room for anger, so I agreed. One afternoon, 1 hour, one final conversation, no cameras, no advisors, no press, just mother and son. Clifford arranged the meeting at his office, neutral ground. His assistant stayed in the front room, no interruptions, no recording, no need for more documentation. What was said would remain between us. I arrived 5 minutes early. Brandon was already sitting inside, alone, slouched in one of the chairs like he had been waiting much longer. He didn't look like himself. His skin was drawn, eyes shadowed. The smooth confidence that used to live in his voice was gone. What remained was brittle, edges showing. He didn't stand when I entered. I didn't expect him to. I took the chair across from him. The space between us felt larger than the room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt earned. He broke it first. I didn't think it would get this far. I looked at him, not with sympathy, just attention. He shifted in his seat, fingers twitching against the edge of the table. You have to believe me. This wasn't meant to happen like that. Things got out of hand. I was angry. I felt like everything was slipping away, and I held up my hand, just enough to stop the sentence. I didn't want explanations. I didn't come for excuses. He understood, or maybe he just remembered who I was. The way we left things, he said, it wasn't fair. I asked him to clarify. He said, I was grieving. You were grieving. And we reacted poorly. Reacted. Like pushing your mother out of her house is a natural emotional reflex. Like changing the locks and sending legal threats is just how people process loss. I didn't reply. He tried again. I know I crossed a line, but you didn't have to make it so public. That was the part that stung him. Not the loss of inheritance, not the legal defeat, but the humiliation, the exposure. I leaned forward, folded my hands on the table. You burned the bridge. I just stood on the other side and watched. He looked down. I loved Dad, he said. You know that. I don't doubt you did, I said. But you loved what he gave you more. That landed. He flinched barely. But it was there. I continued. You didn't fight me because you were mourning. You fought me because you wanted control. And you lost it. He nodded slowly. For the first time, there was no protest. I looked at him for a long moment. There was a time I thought you might be better than this, that maybe you had your father's spine and my restraint. But somewhere along the way, you decided having less than everything meant you had nothing. And so you took aim at the one person who would have stood between you and the world. He exhaled through his nose, quiet. I could see the weight setting in, maybe for the first time. I stood. He stayed seated. Before I left, I spoke one last time. I don't hate you, Brandon. That would imply you still have a place in me. But I don't owe you love, and I certainly don't owe you peace. He swallowed hard. His lips parted, but nothing came out. I turned toward the door. As I reached for the handle, he said my name. Not Mum. Not Mother. Just Louise. I paused. He said, I'm sorry. I didn't turn around. Apologies, when spoken too late, become something else. They're not bridges. They're tombstones. I walked out, leaving the silence behind me. On the sidewalk outside Clifford's office, I paused to breathe. The air was sharp, clean, like winter had arrived early, the kind of cold that doesn't bite, but clears. I had thought for so long that confrontation meant closure, but it didn't. Closure wasn't something Brandon could give me. Closure was something I gave myself the moment I stopped waiting for him to change. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just stood still. For the first time in weeks, the ground felt solid beneath my feet. I moved back into the house in late September. The air smelled different by then, cooler, calmer. The rose bushes I had planted 20 years ago had dropped their last bloom for the season. I walked past them and brushed the tips with my fingers. No one had trimmed them since I left. They had grown wild, but not dead. It took me exactly 12 minutes to walk through the house in full silence. No voices, no chairs out of place, no Megan perfume lingering in the upstairs hallway, no Brandon's laptop open on the dining table. I stopped in the kitchen and ran my hand across the counter. The same one I had wiped 100,000 times, waiting for Henry to come back from the office, or Brandon to come back from school, or for dinner to cool. This time, there was no waiting. The quiet wasn't absence anymore. It was peace. I didn't unpack right away. I just breathed. By the second week, I knew I couldn't stay in the house just to remember what had happened. I didn't want my healing to come from silence alone. I needed to do something, something with direction, something that lived beyond the betrayal. So I opened Henry's old folder labeled Community Ideas. Inside were notes from a time when he and I used to dream out loud. Ideas for scholarships, community gardens, retirement workshops, programs for widows and single mothers. Henry had written them down on scrap paper, sticky notes, even backs of envelopes. We never had time back then. The business always came first, family came next, and there was never enough left for the rest. But now I had time, and the means, and more importantly, the will. With Clifford's help, I took the first steps. The paperwork was long, the approval process slow. But I wasn't in a rush. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about reclaiming what Henry and I believed in long before the world twisted around us. By late November, the Louise Harrington Foundation for Women and Youth was officially chartered. I funded it with $5 million from the trust. The rest would remain invested for long-term impact. The foundation would offer full scholarships for first-generation college students. It would also support programs for widowed women starting over, including housing grants and life skills training. Emily was the first to receive a letter. The young woman who had stood on my lawn that day, watching my suitcase hit the sidewalk. She had no idea I remembered her face, but I did. That kind of kindness lives in the memory. Her scholarship included tuition, housing, and a personal stipend. I wrote her a note with the acceptance packet. It said, "I see in you what I once forgot to see in myself. Take this chance and give back one day, in your own way." She sent me a letter a week later, handwritten, thankful, hopeful. I read it twice and tucked it into Henry's folder. The foundation began small. A team of 5, 3 of them women over 60. One was Dorothy, who used to clean houses part-time in the neighborhood. The others were women from the church, all sharp, practical, with hearts like anchors. Every Tuesday we met at the old town library. Clifford gave us a small annex space to use until our office was ready. There was no plaque on the door, just a paper sign taped to the glass. But people started showing up. Mothers who'd lost jobs, girls who had dropped out of school, grandmothers raising grandchildren, a woman named Carla, who'd been living in her car for 8 months after her son changed the locks. They didn't come with complaints. They came with tired eyes and soft questions. And we met them with warmth, coffee, and something rare these days: respect. I didn't tell them my story, not fully. Some had read the articles, some whispered to each other when I entered the room, but I let the foundation speak louder than any headline ever could. Henry's old study became the operations center. His leather chair still faced the window. I kept it that way. Every time I passed it, I felt him there. Not as a ghost, but as a co-founder. One morning in December, I watched the sunrise from that chair, coffee in hand, blanket over my knees, snow falling in slow silence. And I thought of everything that had broken, and everything that had grown from it. Grief doesn't go away. It changes shape. And if you let it, it makes space for something unexpected. I didn't need Brandon's apology. I didn't need Megan's silence. I didn't even need the public to remember what had happened. I needed only this room, these women, this work. The kind of peace that asks for nothing but presence. In the end, I didn't just keep the house. I filled it. With laughter. With purpose. With people who chose to stay without being paid to. The kitchen now smells of baked bread again. The hallway holds echoes of new voices. And my name, once treated like a burden, now sits on every grant letter sent out with dignity. I am Louise Harrington, widow, mother, betrayed. But more than all of that, I am a woman who stood still when the storm came, and waited until it passed. And when it did, I built something worth staying for. The first winter after Henry passed was quiet in a way I hadn't known before. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. Not the silence of being alone or ignored. This was something else. It was the kind that sat with you like an old friend, the kind that let you hear your own thoughts without judgment. Each morning, I brewed coffee in the same pot Henry had used for years. It made 2 cups. I still made both. One for me, one that stayed untouched. I wasn't keeping up appearances. I wasn't pretending he'd walk into the room. It just felt right. The house, despite its stillness, felt full. Not with people, with memory. There was a softness to it now. A gentleness I hadn't felt when Brandon and Megan were inside, slamming doors, speaking in short sentences, always taking up more space than their presence deserved. Now the house breathed. And in that breath, Henry was everywhere. His coat still hung by the door. His favorite pen sat in the kitchen drawer, the ink likely dried by now, but I couldn't throw it out. The chair by the fireplace still held his old throw blanket. It smelled faintly of cedar, and the aftershave he wore the winter before he left. One evening, I opened the closet in our bedroom. I had left it untouched since the funeral. Inside were rows of his button-downs, his winter coats, and tucked in the back, the navy blue suit he wore on our 25th anniversary. I took it out, ran my fingers along the sleeve. That night, I slept in our bed for the first time since everything happened. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But the tears had done their work weeks ago. This was different. This was an exhale. The next morning, I found a letter Henry had tucked inside one of his books. Not in an envelope, just folded once and placed between the pages of a biography he had been reading before the strokes began. Lou, if you're reading this, then I didn't get the chance to say everything I wanted. We built a life that mattered. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And what matters most now is that you remember how strong you are. They will forget what we did for them. That's how it works. But you must not forget who you are. You are the steady one. You are the anchor. You are the reason it all held together for as long as it did. Love, H. I read it twice, then again. Then I placed it in the desk drawer in his study, along with the note from Emily and the first proposal for the foundation. Pieces of past, present, and future, all in one place. I started walking every afternoon. The neighborhood had changed. New families, new cars in driveways. But the sidewalks remembered me. So did the older trees that arched over the roads like guardians. Mrs. Lawrence from 2 houses down stopped me one day. She had seen the story. She didn't say much, just took my hand in both of hers and nodded. That was enough. Later that week, Reverend Paul came by with a tin of lemon cookies and an old photo album from the church archives. Inside were pictures of Henry and me from the early years, fundraisers, potlucks, a picture of us under the oak tree behind the church, arms linked, eyes closed as he kissed my forehead. I had forgotten that moment. Seeing it again was like walking into a room I thought had been locked. We sat at the kitchen table. He talked. I listened. Then I talked, and he listened better. He said healing does not always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like repetition, like showing up for yourself every day, even when no one else does. He was right. The foundation grew slowly, applications increased. Our first small grant was awarded to a local woman starting a catering business after her husband left. Her name was Teresa. She came into the office with her toddler on one hip and a folder full of recipes in the other. She cried when we approved her. Then I cried too, because that was the point of it all. Not headlines, not vindication, just that quiet exchange. One woman saying I need help, another saying I believe in you. Henry would have loved her spirit. He always admired people who didn't fold when the world turned sharp. At night, I often sat in the den with a book. I rarely finished any of them. My eyes would drift. My mind would wander. But it was enough just to sit there, to know I had made it through the noise. I didn't see Brandon again. He sent one letter in the spring. No return address. No apology. Just a typed page saying he was moving, selling his firm, and wanted to start over somewhere quieter. I folded the letter once, tucked it in the back of my closet, and left it there. Some stories didn't need revisiting. Some wounds didn't need reopening. I wasn't angry anymore, just finished. One Sunday, I walked into the church alone, sat in the same pew Henry and I had shared for decades, the same creak in the floorboard, the same soft light through the stained glass. And I felt him again, not beside me, within me, not gone, just carried. By the end of the service, I knew I had come full circle, not to return to what was, but to live fully in what remained. It was a Tuesday morning when I opened the attic. Not for any particular reason. The house had finally settled into a kind of rhythm. I woke with the sun, drank my coffee with the blinds cracked open, worked in the foundation office 2 or 3 days a week, and spent the rest of my time walking or reading or tending to small things. The days had softened. There was no longer any fire beneath my feet, only steadiness. But that morning, I found myself standing at the foot of the attic ladder with a box of labels and a roll of tape. I figured it was time to sort things, to see what had been left in the corners. The attic smelled like wood and time. Dust floated in the light from the single window. I hadn't been up there since before Henry's second stroke. I walked past the old chairs, the Christmas boxes, the suitcases with frayed handles. In the far corner, beneath a canvas drop-cloth, I saw a set of filing cabinets. They had Henry's handwriting on the tabs. One read, "Taxes." One said, "Contracts." The third, smaller and slightly rusted, had a label that stopped me cold. "Legacy Notes." I pulled the drawer open. Inside were journals, not the kind you write in every day. These were carefully dated with simple covers, most of them marked by month and year. He had started them after his retirement, I guessed. Maybe earlier. One entry per week. Some pages were short, others stretched across 3 or 4 pages. His handwriting was neat, notebooks of a man who liked order. I sat on an overturned box and began to read. The first entry I opened was dated 11 years earlier. It began with a sentence that sounded like Henry to the bone. "This morning I watered the tomatoes and thought about who I used to be." He wrote about work, about business deals he regretted, about people he had trusted who let him down, and people he underestimated who became friends. He didn't name names often, but the emotion was there, between the lines. He was reflective, honest, never bitter. One entry stood out, dated a few months before our 30th anniversary. "Louise held my hand today while we crossed the parking lot at the grocery store. 35 years we've walked beside each other. Still, her hand feels like home." I closed the journal for a moment. Let the quiet fill me. Then I kept reading. Over the next hour, I moved through entry after entry. He wrote about Brandon, about how proud he was when he graduated, and how worried he became when the ambition turned sharper than the gratitude. He mentioned Megan only twice. Once during a family holiday. Once after a fundraising dinner when she had criticized my dress behind my back, not realizing Henry had overheard. He wrote about the company, about leaving it behind, about fearing what might happen if he left too much power in the wrong hands. And then he wrote about me, consistently, quietly, with a reverence I hadn't always known he carried. "Louise is quieter than she used to be, but stronger. I've seen her hold this family together without anyone noticing the seams. She keeps everything running, and no one stops to ask how. I hope she knows I see it." Another entry later. "I worry that I've made decisions that have put her in a place where she must fight for what should be hers by right. I pray I've done enough to protect her when I'm no longer able to speak for her. He had spoken for me, in the will, in the trust, in those videos. But here, in the journals, he spoke for me in a way that didn't need lawyers or banks. He saw me. That night, I brought one of the journals down from the attic and left it on the kitchen table. I didn't read from it again, not right away. Just knowing it was there, beside my coffee cup, beside the stack of application for the next round of grants, was enough. Over the next week, I sorted the rest of the boxes. I found photos I had forgotten, receipts from trips we took when we were younger, birthday cards from Brandon as a child, letters from Henry's mother, all of it carefully kept. quietly preserved. But it was the journals that stayed with me, not just because of what they said, but because of what they proved. Henry had been preparing for the end, not just in the legal ways, not just in protecting me from the fallout of our son's hunger for power. He had been preparing in the quietest, most profound way possible, by recording memory, by passing on perspective. It reminded me of the kind of man he had always been at his best: focused, private, devoted, not always expressive, but deeply rooted. One afternoon, I placed a call to the foundation team. I asked them to come by for tea and a small meeting. 5 of us sat in the living room that Friday, with lemon scones and mugs of chamomile. I shared the journals, not the entries, just the idea that Henry had written through his final decade, that he had documented the struggles and triumphs, that he had thought about legacy not in terms of assets, but in terms of values. We agreed to start a new initiative, a writing project, a program to help widowed women and first-generation college students write their own legacy journals, not to leave behind money or titles, but to leave behind truth. It would begin next spring. Volunteers were already lining up to teach the workshops. Emily offered to coordinate the student participants. Dorothy Heir had a niece who worked as a writing coach. We would build it slowly, but it would come. Henry's legacy would not be a courtroom victory. It would be this: a space for others to say what mattered, before they no longer could. As winter deepened, I found myself sitting in the study more often, reading his words and writing my own. Not because I feared the end, but because I had finally remembered that what we leave behind is not carved in stone or written in ink. It is carried by those who still walk and still remember. By the first week of February, the ground was still hard with frost, but the air had begun to shift. It wasn't spring yet, but winter was loosening its grip. That kind of quiet change, the kind you only notice if you've been still long enough to hear it, was exactly what I felt happening around me. The news had calmed. The stories faded from the front pages. The anger from strangers gave way to silence again, not because people forgot, but because they had moved on. And that was fine. That was good. It meant life kept going. Inside the foundation office, we were busier than ever. The first round of grants had gone out. Emily's writing workshops were set to begin. A small group of women in their 50s and 60s gathered every Wednesday to start their own legacy journals, just like Henry's. They wrote about growing up poor, raising children who forgot them, surviving marriages that chipped away at their names. They wrote about small joys, too: lemon pie recipes passed down, favorite books read in the dark, a neighbor who once lent them soup when they had nothing. None of it was for show. They weren't trying to impress anyone. It was just the act of naming what had been lived, of honoring it. One morning, Dorothy handed me an envelope. No stamp, no return address. She said someone had slipped it through the mail slot before we opened. Inside was a note, typed, signed only with the letter B. It said, "I have nothing left. They sold everything that wasn't nailed down. Megan is gone. She took what little was in her name and moved out 2 weeks ago. I don't blame her. I was never enough for her unless I was winning." There was more. Lines about Henry, about regret, about watching the interviews back and not recognizing his own voice. I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer beside the one he had sent last year, the same drawer I used for things I didn't need to respond to, but also couldn't throw away. That was the last I heard from him. What happens to men like Brandon when the performance ends and the stage is taken down is not something I spend time thinking about anymore. Whatever guilt or reckoning remains is his to carry. I had let go of it long ago. What mattered more now was what had stayed. One afternoon, I walked out to the community garden we had built behind the foundation's new space. A half-acre donated by the city, raised beds, cold frames. Volunteers gathered each week to prep for spring planting. There were 2 benches placed along the edge. I sat on one and watched a group of teenagers from the local high school turning the soil, laughing, joking. One of them had music playing quietly from his phone, a song I didn't recognize. A few feet away, Teresa, the woman we had helped with the catering grant, was handing out warm bread wrapped in foil. Her toddler stood beside her, tugging on her coat sleeve. She caught my eye and waved. Later that evening, I sat by the fireplace at home and opened Henry's journal again. Just one page. He had written, "Some things break and stay broken, but others break open, so something better can grow." I think Louise understands that more than I do. I read the line 3 times. Outside, snow began to fall, not the thick kind that covers the world in silence. Just soft flurries, brushing across the windows, tapping lightly like they didn't want to interrupt. A week later, the city invited the foundation to an event honoring local contributions. Nothing formal, just a gathering of small non-profits, donors, teachers, and volunteers. When I walked in, I didn't expect anything more than a few handshakes and polite conversations. But there, near the front, was a small table with our foundation's logo printed across a cloth banner. And in the center, a framed quote in gold lettering. It read, "You are the reason it held together as long as it did." It was one of Henry's lines from the journal. I stood still for a long moment. The sound of the room faded. My eyes stayed on those words, not because they were mine, but because they were true. After the speeches, a woman approached me. She looked to be in her 40s, well-dressed, tired eyes. She said she had read about me months ago, that she kept the article in her kitchen drawer, that it gave her the courage to leave a house where her name was never spoken with kindness. She thanked me. Then she walked away. That night, I lay in bed and thought of the garden, the women writing their journals, the girls applying for college, the small acts building into something too large to measure. Henry would not have needed applause. He never cared for ceremony, but he would have liked this. The quiet proof that legacy doesn't live in noise. It lives in roots, in gestures, in spaces held open for someone else to step into. The house no longer felt like a place I was protecting. It felt like a place that had done its job, a vessel, a memory made solid. And now it was giving again. I looked around at the walls, the photos, the books, and I whispered one sentence into the dark. "You didn't just leave me a name, Henry. You left me the strength to use it well." By mid-March, the frost had thinned. One afternoon, I stepped onto the porch and saw the first sign of bloom in the planter near the stairs. Daffodils, stubborn little things. They had pushed through the cold, the dry, the hard, and they stood there now like they had always known they would make it. That morning, I had eaten breakfast alone. Same as most mornings, I no longer minded it. I cooked a single egg, brewed my coffee slow, let the radio play soft jazz in the background. The silence no longer felt like emptiness, it felt like mine. There were days I didn't speak to anyone until late afternoon. The office was mostly run by the team now. I showed up when needed, read over proposals, made final approvals. But I had stepped back a little. Not because I was tired, but because I had learned the difference between controlling something and guiding it gently from behind. After everything, people expected me to be louder, more defiant. They wanted a woman who walked around with a gavel in her purse and a fire in her eyes. But the truth was, after all the noise and the bitterness, I didn't want to carry sharpness anymore. I wanted to carry stillness, Clarity, the kind of peace that can't be taken or traded. One night I sat by the fire with a glass of water and a book I had read years ago. The words had changed for me. Or maybe I had changed for the words. I didn't need stories of revenge or triumph anymore. I needed stories of quiet strength, of people who chose grace not because they were weak, but because they had already won. That was what no one told you about healing. It didn't announce itself. It came in small choices. In walking past the room you used to cry in and not stopping. In letting the anger sit on the porch like an old dog, knowing it didn't need to come inside with you. It came in letters you didn't send, in meetings you didn't request, in knowing you could scorch the earth and choosing instead to plant something. A few weeks later I received a call from Emily. She asked if I'd be willing to attend the final session of the journal workshop. Just to listen. Maybe say a few words if I felt like it. I arrived a little early. The building smelled like lavender and ink. On the walls were framed quotes from the women's journals, lines that made your chest ache. That told you exactly what these women had survived. I sat in the back as they took turns reading aloud. One woman, a grandmother who had raised 4 children alone, read a passage about standing in line at the food bank with her pride tucked behind her grocery list. Another woman read about losing her name in a marriage that never once celebrated her, and how she took it back by learning how to sign it again at the bank. There was laughter, too, stories of birthday cakes made from boxed cornbread, of dancing in the kitchen with bare feet, of whispering old songs to babies who were now grown men. When it came time to speak, I stood slowly. My hands rested lightly on the back of the chair in front of me. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't need to. I said I was proud of them. I said healing doesn't look like what we think it should. That sometimes it looks like a woman writing the truth down on paper and not asking anyone's permission. That telling your story is an act of courage, even if no one else ever reads it. And I meant it. Afterward, one of the women hugged me. She smelled like eucalyptus and strong will. She said she had followed the story about my son, that it had helped her walk away from her own. I didn't say much in return, just held her a little longer than usual. That evening, when I got home, I lit a candle in the kitchen, not for ceremony, just for warmth. I poured myself a cup of chamomile and sat down in the armchair Henry used to favour. I let my eyes close. Some part of me thought about Brandon. I wondered if he had found a job, if he had moved somewhere new, if he still blamed me, or if he had finally looked in the mirror long enough to see the truth behind his choices. But I didn't linger on it. That was the gift of survival. You learned what deserved space in your thoughts, and what didn't. I had grieved him, not just the man he became, but the boy I used to love with open arms. I had buried that boy quietly inside me, not with malice, but with acceptance. By the end of the month, the days stretched longer. Light crept in through the blinds earlier each morning. The town's annual spring fair was around the corner. I had volunteered to bake pies for the local church table. Apple and blueberry. No fanfare, just something made by hand. Life, in all its complicated, painful, ordinary beauty, was still moving forward. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I had learned to let go of what no longer needed holding. And in that letting go, I found a space big enough for peace. The morning started like any other. I was out in the backyard, pruning the herbs that had survived the winter in stubborn defiance. Rosemary was holding strong, its fragrance clinging to my fingers. The wind carried the scent of soil and fresh-cut grass. Birds called from the hedges, like they were announcing the world was still turning. I had just come back into the house when I saw the envelope. No name on the front, just a single sheet inside, with blocky handwriting that I hadn't seen in years. It said simply, "I'll be passing through town next week. If you're willing, I'd like to stop by. Only if it doesn't bring you more harm than good." There was no signature, but I knew the writing. Megan. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. Some things, if they come, they come. If not, life continues as it always has. That following Thursday, just after 4 in the afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. Not flashy, just a silver sedan with a dent near the rear bumper. Megan stepped out, dressed plainly in jeans and a button-up blouse, her hair longer than I remembered. She looked older, but not in a way that time had punished her, more like someone who had stopped fighting gravity and started listening to it instead. I opened the door before she could knock. She didn't smile, but her eyes didn't carry the coldness they once had. She stood still for a moment, her hands wrapped around the strap of her bag, then nodded slightly. I stepped aside, said nothing. She walked in, her shoes making soft contact with the old wood floors. The living room hadn't changed much. She noticed that. Her eyes drifted to the fireplace, the bookshelf, the small photo of Henry on the mantel, then to the dining room, where the chairs were now mismatched on purpose. I had sold the original set months ago and found comfort in things that didn't quite match, but still belonged together. We sat in the kitchen. I poured her a cup of tea without asking what she preferred. She accepted it with quiet hands. She began softly, said she was living in Reno now, working part-time at a community center, said she was sorry for how things unfolded, that she hadn't known how deep the rot had gone, that sometimes you don't realize you've been complicit until you're standing in the ash of what you helped build. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't expecting reconciliation. She was just laying it down. She said she didn't stay long after everything came crashing down, that once the money dried up and the interviews stopped, Brandon had fallen into something quiet and dangerous, drinking more, blaming everyone, lashing out in the way cowards do, by isolating and then pretending they're the victim. She left when she realized the silence in the house had become heavier than the noise ever was. I nodded. That much I had suspected. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a journal. Worn edges, marked pages. She placed it on the table between us like it was something sacred. It was Henry's, the one he used to keep in his study, the one I had thought lost when they cleared out his things. I lifted it gently, ran my fingers across the leather. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. My hands said what my mouth didn't know how to form. She told me she had found it among her things when she moved, that Brandon had taken it, likely without understanding its value, that she kept it safe once she realized what it was. Then she said thank you, for not sinking, for standing tall, for not turning the ugliness into more ugliness. She said it taught her something, about herself, about what kind of woman she didn't want to become. Then she stood up. She didn't ask to stay, didn't linger, just said she hoped I would keep doing the work I was doing, and with that, she left. I sat there for a long time, the journal in my lap, the tea gone cold, the sun dipping lower behind the pines. Later that night, I read from it. Henry had written, "Some storms don't pass. They stay inside you, but sometimes they water something you didn't even know was growing." And I understood then what he meant. The people who hurt us may never return, changed. But sometimes, someone who stood nearby comes back, carrying something worth holding. And that is enough. There were no fireworks, no parades, no closing credits rolling with music swelling beneath the final scene. Just the quiet creak of a rocking chair, and the whisper of evening slipping through the trees behind my house. I don't remember the exact moment when I stopped needing answers. Maybe it was when I held Henry's journal again, or when I saw Megan's eyes finally free from calculation. Or maybe it was earlier, when I stepped out of Clifford's office that cold day and realized I didn't want revenge anymore. Not because they didn't deserve it, but because I deserved more than them. People say closure is a destination, but it's not. It's a quiet place inside yourself where the noise of what they did no longer echoes louder than the life you've built since. For a long time, I carried pain like armor. It made me sharper, faster, more vigilant. I thought staying angry meant staying strong, but that anger took up space that could have been filled with something softer, something mine. Now, I spend my mornings in the garden, my afternoons at the women's center, and sometimes I sit with women who look like me and hurt like I did. I tell them not to rush the healing, that scars are slow storytellers, that not every chapter has a villain worth naming. Sometimes the villain is silence or regret, or the part of you that forgot how to fight. I look around my home now and feel no ghosts. Henry is here, but not in grief. He's here in the wind chimes he hung outside the porch, in the smoothness of the wood he carved into the banister. He's in the letter he wrote me on our 20th anniversary, tucked into the back of that journal, where he wrote, "You are not built for war, Louise. But if war comes to you, I hope you fight like you're protecting your peace, not proving your worth." He always saw what I could not, and in the end, I think I became the woman he knew I was. Brandon never wrote again. I don't think he will. I don't wish him harm. I don't wish him well either. I simply don't wish. And that, for me, is peace. Megan's visit never repeated, but her silence since has been a gentle one, the kind that says she understands the door was never hers to knock on again, and that is enough. The trust I created in Henry's name is thriving, not because of how much it holds, but because of what it represents. Each woman who walks through those doors isn't just seeking shelter or advice. She's looking for a mirror, something that says, "You're not crazy, you're not broken, you're just bruised." And bruises fade. I think about that a lot now. The fading. How anger once pulsed through me like blood, hot and constant. And now? Now I sit beneath my maple tree with a cup of tea, and I hear the leaves rustling like they're whispering, "Let it go, let it go." So I do. Not all at once, not perfectly, but piece by piece. Some nights, I still wake up to the memory of that awful afternoon, the door slamming behind me, their voices laughing, their footsteps walking away. But it doesn't hold the same weight anymore. That memory is just a stone at the bottom of a river. It doesn't stop the current. It just rests there, still and powerless. I didn't win, not in the way some people think winning looks like. I didn't get an apology parade. I didn't walk away with a trophy or a headline. I walked away standing tall. And sometimes that's the most a woman like me can hope for. Not to conquer, but to reclaim. Not to shout, but to speak clearly. Not to burn it down, but to rebuild in the ashes something warmer, softer, quieter. Something mine. If any part of this story echoed in your heart, even just a little, I'm sending you a quiet nod from across the screen. We may not know each other, but if you've ever felt pushed aside, forgotten, or underestimated, I hope this story reminded you that your silence doesn't mean surrender. Your calm can be your strength. And your story, whatever chapter you're in, is far from over.